The train departed Hollow Junction right on schedule, as it always did. It was a modest, forgotten line, used mostly by night travellers seeking to avoid crowded buses and planes. The route cut through desolate farmlands and shadowy forests, connecting nowhere to nowhere faster than a car ever could. For Ella, a college student heading back to her small hometown for a rare weekend visit, it was the perfect escape. She liked the quiet of the midnight train, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks, the gentle sway of the cars. It all lulled her into a sense of comfort. But tonight felt different. As Ella boarded at the nearly empty station, she noticed an odd energy in the air. A biting chill swept through the platform despite the mild spring evening. The few other passengers looked just as uneasy, glancing around as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the darkness. Ella shook off her nerves and found a seat near the back of the car. She popped in her earbuds, cranking up her playlist to drown out the world. The train lurched forward, and the dim platform lights disappeared into the night. The first hour passed uneventfully. Ella's car held only a handful of passengers, an elderly man reading a book, a middle-aged woman knitting, and a young couple whispering to each other in hushed tones. The conductor shuffled through once, punching tickets without a word. Ella stared out the window, watching the trees blur by. Beyond the glass, the forest was a sea of impenetrable darkness, interrupted only by the occasional flash of moonlight. Her music stopped suddenly. She frowned and pulled out her phone, tapping the screen. No service. That wasn't unusual on this route, but her downloaded playlist should have been fine. She tried again. The music app wouldn't open. The phone buzzed in her hand, the screen flickering. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw a single notification appear. Incoming call, unknown. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Logic told her it was a glitch, but curiosity got the better of her. She answered. Static crackled in her ear, followed by a faint whisper, "You shouldn't be here." Ella froze. "Hello? Who is this?" The line went dead. She pulled out her earbuds, suddenly hyper-aware of her surroundings. The train car seemed quieter than before, the usual hum of the engine muted. The other passengers sat motionless, their faces obscured by shadows. Ella's pulse quickened. She stood and walked toward the elderly man, who hadn't turned a page in his book for several minutes. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The man didn't respond. She stepped closer, reaching out to tap his shoulder. His head snapped up and Ella gasped. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with an unnatural light. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, a low, guttural growl emanated from deep within his chest. Ella stumbled back, tripping over a bag and landing hard on the floor. When she looked up, the man was gone. His book lay open on the seat, its pages blank. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to her feet. She turned to the other passengers, only to find their seats empty as well. The young couple, the knitting woman, they had vanished without a trace. The train car was completely silent now, save for her own ragged breathing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing down the empty aisle. No answer. She made her way to the next car, her footsteps unnervingly loud on the metal floor. The door slid open with a groan, revealing another empty car. "Is anyone here?" Still nothing. The train rocked slightly, and she grabbed a seat for balance. Outside, the forest seemed closer, its twisted branches scraping against the windows like claws. Ella reached the conductor's cabin, relief flooding her when she saw a figure standing at the controls. "Thank God," she said, stepping inside. "I think something's wrong." The conductor turned, and Ella's words caught in her throat. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes clouded like those of the elderly man. He raised a trembling hand, pointing toward the window. Ella followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, skeletal form with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. It kept pace with the train, moving unnaturally fast, despite the uneven ground. Ella stumbled back. "What is that?" The conductor didn't answer. He simply vanished, fading into the air like smoke. The train began to slow, its brakes screeching in protest. Ella clung to a nearby railing, her heart hammering in her chest. Through the window, she saw the forest open up to reveal a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling station, its wooden beams warped with age. The train came to a halt, the doors sliding open with a hiss. Ella hesitated. every instinct screaming at her to stay on board. But something compelled her to step off, as if an unseen force was guiding her. The platform was eerily quiet, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. She approached the station, her footsteps crunching on the cracked, overgrown pavement. Inside, the walls were covered in faded posters and graffiti. A single light bulb flickered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows. Then she saw them. The passengers from the train stood in the center of the room, their faces blank and unseeing. The elderly man clutched his empty book. The knitting woman held a pair of needles that dripped with a dark, viscous liquid. The skeletal figure loomed behind them, its glowing eyes fixed on Ella. "You don't belong here," it rasped, its voice echoing inside her head. "What do you want?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. It tilted its head, almost as if curious. To take what was promised. Ella didn't understand, but she didn't wait to find out. She turned and ran, her breath hitching as she sprinted back to the train. The doors closed behind her just as the figure reached the platform. The train lurched forward, gaining speed. Ella collapsed into a seat, her entire body shaking. She glanced out the window, half expecting to see the figure chasing after them, but the clearing was empty. The train moved faster and faster, the forest blurring into a wall of green and black. When it finally pulled into Pinecrest Station, the platform was bustling with people. Ella stumbled off, her legs weak beneath her. She turned to look at the train, but it was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. Ella never took the midnight train again. She avoided the tracks entirely, haunted by the whispers and glowing eyes. But sometimes, late at night, she could still hear the faint hum of the engine in the distance, a chilling reminder of the journey she'd barely survived. The rain lashed against the platform as Natalie waited for the midnight train. Her coat clung to her damp body, and her breath misted in the cold November air. She glanced at the flickering departure board. Train 137 to Maplewood, on time. She was exhausted. The late shift at the hospital had run over again, and her head pounded from the fluorescent lights and endless ringing of call buttons. All she wanted was to get home, crawl into bed, and forget about the world. The train pulled into the station with a metallic screech, its arrival heralded by a gust of damp, stale air. The doors hissed open, and Natalie stepped inside, the warmth of the train wrapping around her like a blanket. The carriage was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, a man with headphones slumped in his seat, a woman knitting quietly near the front, and a hunched figure at the very back. Natalie chose a seat near the middle, settling by the window. The rhythmic sound of the train wheels clattering against the tracks was almost soothing. She pulled out her phone, scrolling aimlessly through messages she didn't feel like answering. Then she felt it, a strange prickling on the back of her neck. She glanced up, her eyes scanning the carriage. The knitting woman was still focused on her needles, and the man with headphones hadn't moved. But the figure at the back, they were staring at her. Natalie froze. The figure was shrouded in shadow, the dim overhead lights failing to illuminate their face. All she could make out was their silhouette, hunched forward in an almost predatory stance. She turned back to her phone, trying to shake off the unease. "It's just a tired commuter," she told herself. "You're imagining things." But the feeling didn't go away. Every time she looked up, the figure was still watching, their head tilted slightly, as if studying her every move. Natalie's heartbeat quickened, and she shifted in her seat, trying to position herself so the figure was out of her line of sight. The train plunged into a tunnel, and the world outside the window turned pitch black. The dim lights overhead flickered, casting the carriage in an eerie, strobe-like glow. Natalie glanced at the other passengers for reassurance, but the man with headphones was staring blankly ahead, his face pale and expressionless. The knitting woman had stopped mid-stitch, her hands frozen as if she'd forgotten what she was doing. The train emerged from the tunnel, and the sudden light made Natalie blink. When her vision cleared, she saw that the figure at the back was no longer in their seat. Her chest tightened. She scanned the carriage, her eyes darting to every corner, but the figure was gone. The man with headphones hadn't moved, and the knitting woman was now staring down at her unfinished project, her face oddly blank. Natalie's fingers tightened around her phone. She debated sending a text to her roommate, just in case. "Stop it," she scolded herself. "You're being ridiculous." A sound broke through her thoughts, a faint, shuffling noise. It was coming from behind her. Natalie's breath hitched. She didn't want to turn around. Every instinct in her body screamed to stay still, but her curiosity got the better of her. Slowly, she twisted in her seat. There was no one there. The aisle was empty. She exhaled shakily and turned back around, trying to calm her racing heart. But just as she settled back into her seat, her phone screen lit up with a notification. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Why did you look away?" Natalie's blood turned to ice. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen. She glanced around the carriage, her eyes wide and searching, but everyone else seemed oblivious. She typed back a single word, "Who?" The response came almost immediately. "The one who's been watching you." Natalie shot to her feet, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She moved toward the nearest passenger, the knitting woman. "Excuse me," Natalie said, her voice shaky. "Did you see anyone come down the aisle just now?" The woman didn't respond. Her head jerked up, but her eyes were glassy and unfocused, as if she weren't fully present. Natalie backed away, her pulse thundering in her ears. She turned to the man with headphones. "Sir, I need help, please." He didn't move. His head hung low, and when she stepped closer, she realized his headphones weren't plugged into anything. Natalie stumbled back, panic setting in. The train entered another tunnel and the lights flickered wildly. In the brief flashes of light and shadow, she saw it. Movement at the far end of the carriage. The figure was back, and they were walking toward her. Natalie bolted, sprinting down the aisle toward the next carriage. She yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on the glass, shouting for help, but the neighboring carriage was empty. Behind her, the footsteps grew louder. She spun around, her back pressed against the door. The figure loomed closer, their face still obscured by shadow. "Stay away!" Natalie screamed, holding up her phone like a weapon. The train jolted, and she lost her balance, crashing to the floor. When she looked up, the figure was standing over her. For the first time, she saw their face, or rather, the lack of it. Their features were a void, a blank canvas where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. Natalie scrambled backward, but the figure reached down, their shadowy hand closing around her wrist. "You shouldn't have looked away," they whispered, their voice echoing in her mind. The world went black. When Natalie woke, she was lying on the platform at Maplewood Station. The train was gone, and the station was silent. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with trembling hands and saw a single message: "We'll be watching." The small-town station of Black Hollow was the last place anyone wanted to be after dark. The platform, overgrown with weeds and lit by a single flickering bulb, felt abandoned by time. The train that serviced it, Line 13, was just as neglected, a creaking relic of rust and peeling paint. Yet every night it arrived like clockwork, shrouded in whispers of strange happenings. Tonight, Mason had no choice. His car had broken down on the way back from a job interview in the city, and the midnight train was his only way home. As he stepped onto the platform, he felt a chill that wasn't just from the autumn wind. The train screeched to a halt, its headlights cutting through the fog. The conductor, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, opened the door without a word. Mason hesitated, a strange sense of foreboding gripping him. Shaking it off, he climbed aboard. The train was nearly empty. A young woman sat near the front, her face pale and drawn. Across from her, an older man in a threadbare coat stared out the window, muttering under his breath. Mason chose a seat toward the back, dropping his bag onto the floor. The car smelled faintly of mildew, and the lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The train jerked forward, and the station disappeared into the fog. Mason leaned back, trying to ignore the gnawing unease in his chest. Half an hour passed, and the train began to slow. Mason glanced out the window, expecting to see the lights of a small town or another station. Instead, there was only darkness. The train had stopped in the middle of nowhere. "What's going on?" he muttered. The conductor walked through the car, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. He stopped at Mason's seat, his expression unreadable. "Tracks are unclear," the conductor said, his voice low and gravelly. "We'll be moving shortly." Mason nodded, though the explanation didn't sit right with him. As the conductor disappeared into the next car, Mason noticed the young woman at the front was now staring directly at him. Her eyes were wide, almost pleading. "Don't get off," she mouthed. Mason frowned. "What?" he whispered aloud. but she didn't repeat herself. The train started moving again, but the view outside had changed. Where there had once been stretches of fields and trees, there was now only mist, dense and impenetrable, swirling like something alive. The old man by the window began to mutter louder, his words spilling out in a frantic rhythm. "They're coming. They always come. You can't stop them." The young woman shifted in her seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. Mason leaned forward. "Who's coming?" She didn't answer, but the lights in the car flickered again, plunging them into brief darkness. When they came back on, the old man was gone. His coat remained on the seat, but he was nowhere to be seen. Mason shot to his feet. "Did anyone see that? He's gone," the woman said flatly. "They take the weakest first." "What are you talking about?" Mason demanded, his voice rising. The woman gestured toward the window. "Look for yourself." Mason hesitated but peered outside. Shapes moved in the mist, vague, shadowy figures that seemed to glide just beyond the glass. He couldn't make out any details, but he felt their eyes on him, cold and unrelenting. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, backing away. The train shuddered violently, throwing him into a seat. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, Mason saw one of the shapes inside the car. It was tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs and a face that seemed more like a mask, a blank, expressionless void. When the lights stabilized, the figure was gone. "They're not real," Mason said, more to himself than anyone else. "This can't be real." "They're as real as we let them be," the woman said. The train began to pick up speed, the mist outside blurring into streaks of grey. Mason pulled out his phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen displayed nothing but static. "Trying to call for help?" the woman asked, her voice bitter. "There's no help coming. Once you're on this train, it doesn't let you go." "That's insane," Mason snapped. "Is it?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You think this train is heading somewhere? It hasn't been to a real station in decades." Mason stared at her, his mind racing. "Then why are we here? Why are you here?" "Because we got on," she said simply. The train screeched again, and Mason's stomach churned as the lights dimmed. Outside, the mist had cleared slightly, revealing a sprawling, overgrown cemetery. The tombstones were cracked and leaning, their inscriptions worn away by time. The conductor appeared again, his hollow eyes scanning the car. "Next stop," he said. "All passengers must disembark." "No," the woman said firmly. "Don't leave this car." The conductor turned to her, a flicker of something like recognition crossing his face. "You don't belong here." Before she could respond, the shadows surged through the windows, pouring into the car like smoke. They swirled around the conductor, dragging him toward the back of the train. His screams were brief, cutting off as abruptly as they'd begun. Mason grabbed the woman's arm. "What do we do?" She hesitated, then pulled a small rusted key from her pocket. "This unlocks the control cabin. If we can stop the train, we might have a chance." "Why do you have that?" "I've been here before," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't make it out last time." The two of them raced toward the front of the train, dodging the shifting shadows that clawed at them from the corners. The air grew colder with every step, and Mason's breath came in visible puffs. When they reached the cabin, the woman shoved the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with outdated controls and dials that glowed faintly. Mason grabbed the throttle, but it wouldn't budge. "Come on," he growled, pulling with all his strength. The shadows began to seep into the cabin, pooling at their feet. "Do something!" the woman screamed. Mason spotted a lever labelled Emergency Stop. Without thinking, he yanked it down. The train screamed as it ground to a halt, throwing them both to the floor. The shadows recoiled, dissipating like smoke in the wind. When Mason looked up, the cabin was empty. The woman was gone, and outside, the mist had cleared to reveal a desolate station. The sign above the platform read Black Hollow. Mason stepped off the train, his heart pounding. The platform was exactly as he'd left it hours ago, but the train was gone. He never saw the midnight train again, but every so often, late at night, he swore he could hear it, its mournful whistle echoing through the darkness, carrying whispers of the souls it had taken. The midnight train from Ashwood to Pinecrest had always been a lifeline for travellers. Cutting through the rugged countryside, it carried people from small, forgotten towns to bustling cities. The route was long and winding, with stretches of dense forest that seemed to swallow the train whole. But it was dependable. It always reached its destination. Until the night, it didn't. A cold rain drummed against the windows as passengers boarded the train at Ashwood Station. Among them was Mia, a graduate student returning home after a long week. She slid into a window seat, her backpack tucked at her feet, and let out a sigh of relief. The car was sparsely populated, an elderly woman knitting in the corner, a businessman typing furiously on his laptop, and a young couple chatting quietly. The conductor, a stern man with a thick moustache, passed through punching tickets with mechanical efficiency. Mia settled in, lulled by the rhythmic hum of the engine as the train pulled away from the station. Outside, the rain blurred the world into a watery haze, and soon the familiar sounds of the train's wheels on the tracks became her only company. The trouble began an hour into the journey. The train slowed unexpectedly, the engine letting out a low, tortured groan. Mia glanced up, frowning. Outside, the darkness of the forest pressed against the windows. "Is this a stop?" someone asked aloud. The conductor appeared at the front of the car, his face pale. "We've encountered a delay," he announced. "Please remain seated. We'll resume shortly." Murmurs spread through the passengers. Mia checked her phone, no signal. She shrugged it off, assuming it was a minor technical issue. But the minutes stretched into an hour, and then 2. The passengers grew restless, their voices rising in irritation. "Why aren't we moving?" the businessman demanded, standing up. "I have a meeting in the morning." The conductor didn't respond. He was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. Mia followed his gaze and felt a chill crawl down her spine. Outside, the forest seemed unnaturally still. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. There was no sign of wind, no sound of wildlife, only an oppressive, suffocating quiet. As midnight came and went, the train's lights flickered. The elderly woman clutched her knitting needles tightly, muttering a prayer under her breath. The young couple huddled together, their earlier cheer replaced by unease. "We can't just sit here," the businessman snapped. He stomped toward the front of the car, banging on the conductor's cabin door. "Hey, do something!" The conductor stepped into the aisle, his face grim. "The engine isn't responding," he said. "I've sent a distress signal, but there's no reply. We're stuck." "Stuck?" Mia repeated, her voice trembling. "What do you mean?" "The train won't move," he replied. "I've checked the controls, everything seems fine, but it's like it doesn't want to go." His words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Hours passed. The rain outside turned to mist, swirling eerily around the train. Mia tried to distract herself, flipping through a book she'd brought, but she couldn't focus. Something about the silence outside felt wrong, as though the forest was holding its breath. A scream shattered the uneasy quiet. Mia bolted upright, her heart racing. The sound had come from the rear of the train. She and a few others ran toward the noise, their footsteps echoing in the empty car. They found the source, a man lying on the floor, his face pale and contorted in terror. "What happened?" Mia asked, kneeling beside him. He pointed a trembling finger toward the window. "There was something out there," he whispered, watching us. Mia glanced outside, but saw only darkness. "Are you sure?" The man nodded frantically. It had eyes. Glowing eyes. The passengers began to panic. The businessman demanded answers while the young couple clung to each other, whispering frantically. "We have to leave," someone said. "Leave," the conductor snapped. "We're miles from anywhere. The forest is dangerous at night." "So is staying here," the businessman shot back. Mia felt torn. She didn't relish the idea of wandering through the woods in the dark, but the train felt like a trap. As they argued, the lights flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on. The darkness was absolute, swallowing the train whole. The passengers scrambled for their phones, their flashlights casting shaky beams of light. Mia's pulse quickened as she heard something, a faint scratching sound like claws on metal. It was coming from the roof. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The others fell silent, their faces pale in the dim light. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then came the thud of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving toward the front of the train. "What is that?" the young woman whispered, clutching her partner's arm. No one answered. The footsteps stopped. The train was deathly quiet again, but the silence felt loaded, as if something unseen was waiting. Suddenly, the door at the front of the car slammed open. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, its form impossibly tall and gaunt. Its glowing eyes pierced the darkness, scanning the terrified passengers. Mia's breath caught in her throat. The thing stepped forward, its movements unnatural, as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. "Stay back!" the businessman shouted, holding up his briefcase like a shield. The creature tilted its head, almost curiously, before letting out a guttural growl that reverberated through the car. Chaos erupted. The passengers scrambled to the back of the train, tripping over seats and each other in their desperation to escape. Maya grabbed the elderly woman's arm, pulling her along. "We can't outrun it," the conductor said, his voice trembling. "We have to fight." "With what?" the businessman shouted. Before anyone could answer, the creature lunged, its claws slicing through the air. The passengers scattered, their screams echoing through the train. Mia ducked into a storage compartment, her heart pounding as she tried to steady her breathing. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the struggle, shouts, crashes, and the inhuman growls of the creature. When the noise subsided, Mia cautiously peeked out. The car was a wreck, with overturned seats and broken windows. The creature was gone, but so were several passengers. "What happened?" she asked the conductor, who was slumped against a wall, clutching a bleeding arm. "It took them," he said. "Dragged them into the woods." "Why?" Mia whispered. He shook his head. "I don't know, but it's not over." As dawn approached, the mist outside began to lift, revealing the twisted, gnarled trees of the forest. The remaining passengers huddled together, their faces pale and haunted. The train remained motionless, a ghostly monument in the wilderness. Mia stared out the window, her mind racing. She didn't know what had stopped the train or why the creature had come, but one thing was certain: they weren't supposed to leave. The forest had claimed them, and it wasn't letting go.
It was the kind of train ride that no one forgot, if they lived to tell the tale. The Midnight Express from Ashfield to Denver wasn't a luxury train, but it was reliable. It cut through remote towns and dense forests, often carrying a mix of late-shift workers, travelers, and the occasional drifter. The passengers rarely interacted, each keeping to themselves. That's why, when Michelle boarded at Ashfield Station, the mood in the carriage immediately unsettled her. The train was unusually quiet. There were no low murmurs of conversation, no laughter, not even the faint tapping of someone texting. The passengers sat in tense silence, their eyes flicking toward the doors at every sound. Michelle chose a seat near the middle of the car and settled in, tucking her bag under the seat. She took out her phone to message her sister, but the signal was already fading. The train jolted to life, and she felt the familiar sway as it left the station. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks was almost soothing, but the heavy atmosphere in the car was impossible to ignore. She glanced around, trying to make sense of it. A man in a rumpled suit sat across from her, staring out the window, but not seeming to register the passing scenery. Further down, a young woman nervously adjusted her scarf, her eyes darting toward the back of the car. An older man with a weathered face sat stiffly near the door, clutching a worn briefcase as if it were a lifeline. It wasn't long before Michelle noticed the whispers. Two passengers near the front were leaning close, speaking in hushed tones. She strained to hear, but only caught fragments. Police didn't... Still out there? No way off until Denver. Michelle frowned, her unease deepening. She leaned toward the man in the suit. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Do you know what's going on? Everyone seems... tense." The man didn't look at her. "You should have taken the next train," he muttered, barely audible. "What do you mean?" He finally turned to face her, and the haunted look in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. "He's on this train." Before she could ask who he was, the lights flickered, and the train plunged into darkness. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the car. Michelle gripped the edge of her seat, her pulse quickening. After a few seconds, the lights sputtered back on. That's when she noticed it. One of the seats near the rear of the car was empty. She could have sworn someone had been sitting there earlier, a man in a dark hoodie. "Where did he go?" Michelle whispered to herself. The older man with the briefcase stood abruptly, his voice trembling, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "We need to stay together. No one should wander off alone." "Do you think he's really here?" the young woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was spotted boarding at Ashfield," the older man replied. "The police didn't get here in time." "Who are you talking about?" Michelle demanded, her voice louder than intended. The older man turned to her, his face pale. "The Midnight Killer." Michelle froze. She'd heard the news reports over the past few weeks, a string of brutal murders along train routes, each one more gruesome than the last. The killer always struck at night, disappearing before anyone could catch him. "Wait," Michelle said, her voice shaking. "You think he's on this train?" "We know he is," the man in the suit said grimly. Panic rippled through the passengers. A few stood, looking frantically toward the exits, but there was nowhere to go. The train wouldn't stop until it reached Denver, and that was still hours away. The lights flickered again, plunging the car into intermittent darkness. This time, when they came back on, another seat was empty. The whispers turned to shouts. "Where's the woman with the scarf?" someone cried. Michelle's heart pounded as she scanned the carriage. The young woman who'd been sitting a few rows ahead was gone, her scarf left draped over the back of her seat. "We need to find her," Michelle said, standing up. "No," the older man said firmly. "We stay here, together." "What if she's hurt?" Michelle argued. "She could still be alive." "Or she's already dead," the man in the suit muttered. The group fell into a tense silence, their fear palpable. Michelle couldn't just sit there. Against the protests of the others, she moved toward the connecting door at the back of the car. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the handle, then pulled it open. The next car was eerily empty. The seats were unoccupied, the overhead lights casting long, flickering shadows. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing unnaturally. No response. She stepped inside, her footsteps sounding unnervingly loud. As she moved down the aisle, she spotted something on the floor, a trail of dark red droplets leading toward the rear of the car. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to follow the trail. It ended at a closed restroom door. "Is someone in there?" she asked, her voice shaking. No answer. She reached for the handle, her hand trembling. Slowly, she pushed the door open. Inside, the young woman lay slumped against the wall, her lifeless eyes staring at nothing. Blood pooled around her, the knife wound in her chest unmistakable. Michelle stumbled back, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a scream. Then she heard it, a faint shuffling behind her. She spun around, but the aisle was empty. The air felt heavy, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint hum of the train. And then, a shadow moved. It was quick, darting between the rows of seats. Michelle's heart raced as she backed away, her eyes darting around the car. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a dark hoodie, his face obscured. In his hand was a bloodied knife. Michelle turned and ran, her breath coming in panicked gasps. She burst through the connecting door, back into the car with the other passengers. "He's here!" she shouted. "He's in the next car!" The passengers stared at her in horror, but before anyone could react, the killer appeared in the doorway. Chaos erupted. People screamed and scrambled to the far end of the car, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the murderer. The killer moved slowly, deliberately, his knife glinting under the flickering lights. Michelle grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and stepped into his path. "Stay back!" she shouted, holding the extinguisher like a weapon. The killer tilted his head, as if amused, before lunging at her. She swung the extinguisher, heavy metal colliding with his arm. The knife clattered to the floor, and Michelle kicked it away. "Run!" she yelled to the others. The passengers bolted, fleeing toward the next car. Michelle followed, slamming the door shut behind her. The group barricaded themselves in, using suitcases and anything else they could find to block the door. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the car. The killer was coming for them. When the train finally arrived in Denver the next morning, authorities found the passengers huddled in the last car, shaken but alive. The killer was gone, his escape as mysterious as his presence. But the blood-stained knife left on the floor was a chilling reminder that he'd been real, and that he could strike again. This story combines suspense, action, and psychological terror, building tension with every flicker of the train lines. The night train from Hollow Point to Blackridge was a relic of the past. Its steel frame groaned under its own weight, and its engine, though refurbished, let out deep, guttural roars that echoed for miles. To some, it was a nostalgic ride through small towns and countryside. To others, it was a lifeline connecting forgotten places to the modern world. Liam sat near the back of the train, his sketchbook balanced on his lap. He was a freelance illustrator traveling for a last-minute job in Blackridge. He found the rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels soothing, but the other passengers didn't seem to share his calm. The car was sparsely filled, mostly with locals. They sat quietly, their gazes fixed out the windows or on the floor, avoiding eye contact. A heavy air of unease clung to them, though Liam couldn't figure out why. As the train pulled away from Hollow Point Station, a woman across the aisle glanced at him nervously. She leaned closer. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, her voice low. "No," Liam replied with a polite smile. "Just passing through." Her expression darkened. "You picked the wrong train." Before Liam could ask what she meant, the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your conductor speaking. We'll be making fewer stops tonight due to some unforeseen track closures. Please remain in your seats and enjoy the ride." Liam frowned. The announcement didn't sound unusual, but something about the conductor's tone seemed off. The train picked up speed, the countryside blurring outside the windows. Liam turned his attention back to his sketchbook, but the woman's words lingered in his mind. 2 hours into the journey, the train was moving faster than seemed normal. The sound of the wheels on the tracks grew louder, more aggressive. Liam noticed a man at the front of the car stand and make his way toward the conductor's cabin. A few minutes later, the man returned, his face pale. "What's wrong?" another passenger asked. The man shook his head. "He wouldn't open the door. I don't think he's in control anymore." A murmur of unease spread through the car. Liam looked out the window and realized they were far from the usual route. Instead of small towns or open fields, the train was cutting through dense, unmarked forest. "Where are we?" he muttered to himself. The woman across the aisle leaned closer again. "This train has a history," she whispered. "It's been running these tracks for over a century. They say it's cursed." Liam raised an eyebrow. "Cursed?" She nodded. "There have been accidents, horrible ones. People say the train has a mind of its own. It doesn't always follow the schedule. Sometimes it doesn't stop." Before Liam could respond, the train jolted violently. Passengers screamed as luggage fell from overhead compartments. Liam grabbed the armrest, his heart pounding. "What the hell was that?" someone shouted. The woman turned toward the window, her face pale. "It's happening." The train roared down the tracks, faster than any locomotive should have been able to go. Trees and rocks blurred past, their shadows flickering like phantoms against the windows. Then Liam saw it. A truck parked at a rural crossing up ahead. A man in a reflective vest stood beside it, waving a flashlight. "He's trying to stop us," he said, standing there. The train didn't slow. Instead, the engine let out an ear-splitting howl, like a beast scenting its prey. The horn blared, but it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a challenge. "No, no, no!" Liam shouted. The truck disappeared under the train's steel maw with a sickening crunch, the man's flashlight spinning into the night. The passengers screamed, some covering their eyes, others pressing themselves against their seats in horror. Liam turned away, bile rising in his throat. "We have to stop this thing!" He and a few other passengers pushed their way toward the conductor's cabin, pounding on the locked door. "Open up!" Liam shouted. "We're going too fast!" There was no response. A passenger beside him, a burly man in a flannel jacket, took a fire extinguisher from the wall and smashed it against the door. It took several swings, but the lock finally gave way. The cabin was empty. What the... Liam trailed off, staring at the controls. The dials and levers moved on their own, the speed gauge pinned in the red. "No one's driving this thing?" the man in flannel exclaimed. Liam's gaze fell on a plaque mounted above the controls. It was old, tarnished, but the inscription was still legible. The Iron Beast, bound to its tracks, fueled by blood. He stepped back, a cold dread washing over him. The train tore through the forest, its horn blaring with every obstacle in its path. A herd of deer tried to cross the tracks, but they didn't stand a chance. The passengers recoiled at the wet thuds, and the streaks of red left in the train's wake.
"Where's it going?" someone cried. "It doesn't matter," the woman from across the aisle said. "It won't stop until it's finished." "Finished with what?" Liam demanded. She hesitated, her voice trembling. "Taking what it wants." The lights in the car flickered, and a deep, guttural noise filled the air. It wasn't the engine or the wheels. It was something else, something alive. The walls of the car seemed to pulse, the metal groaning as if under immense strain. Shadows shifted unnaturally, stretching and twisting across the ceiling. "What's happening?" a teenager near the back shouted. Liam didn't answer. His attention was drawn to the floor, where thin streams of dark liquid seeped between the cracks. He touched it hesitantly, pulling his hand back to find it coated in blood. "This isn't real," he whispered, but the growing panic around him said otherwise. The train barreled through a small town, ignoring the station entirely. People on the platform screamed and dove out of the way as the Iron Beast roared past, its horn echoing like a death knell. Inside, the passengers were in chaos. The air grew stiflingly hot, the lights flickering faster, casting the car in an unsettling strobe. Liam clung to a pole, his mind racing. "We have to find a way to stop it," he said. "How?" the man in flannel asked. "The controls don't work, no one's driving." Liam's eyes darted to the emergency brake at the front of the car. Without hesitation, he lunged for it and pulled with all his strength. Nothing happened. The woman from across the aisle grabbed his arm. "It's not a normal train," she said. "You can't stop it like that. You have to make it choose to stop." "What does that even mean?" Liam snapped. But before she could answer, the car lurched again. The walls groaned as the shadows coalesced into a single massive form. It towered over the passengers, its glowing red eyes fixed on Liam. The creature let out a deafening roar, its presence suffocating. Liam stumbled back, his mind reeling. "What do you want?" he shouted. The creature didn't speak, but the answer came to him anyway. A voice, deep and ancient, echoing in his head. "Sacrifice." The train hurtled toward its final destination, a dead-end tunnel carved into the side of a mountain. Liam realized too late what was about to happen. "No!" he shouted, but the train didn't slow. The Iron Beast plunged into the darkness, its passengers' screams swallowed by the void. When the train emerged on the other side, it was empty, and it kept going, waiting for the next ones. It started with a missed connection. Ben had spent the weekend visiting his sister in Brighton, a quiet seaside town, and was returning to the city on Sunday night. He'd been delayed leaving her house, and by the time he reached the station, the last regular train of the evening had already departed. Annoyed but unwilling to shell out for a hotel, he asked at the ticket counter if there were any other options. The board attendant barely looked up from his phone as he handed Ben a schedule. "There's one more train tonight," the man said. "Midnight, track 7. Ben frowned. "I thought the midnight train was discontinued years ago." The attendant shrugged. "It runs sometimes, special route, but fair warning, it doesn't stop at every station." Ben hesitated, but decided it was better than spending the night on a bench. He thanked the man and headed to track 7. The platform was deserted. A cold wind whistled through the station, carrying the faint smell of rust and damp concrete. Ben checked his watch. 11:57 p.m. Moments later, the train arrived. It emerged from the darkness with an almost predatory silence, its black exterior gleaming under the dim platform lights. There were no logos, no identifying marks, just a long, featureless train that looked newer than any Ben had ever seen. The doors slid open and Ben stepped inside. The carriage was immaculate. The seats were upholstered in dark leather. and the floor was polished to a mirror-like shine. But it was empty, completely empty. "Must be a slow night," Ben muttered, choosing a seat near the middle. The doors closed with a soft hiss, and the train pulled away from the station. The motion was so smooth that Ben barely felt it. He settled into his seat, grateful for the peace and quiet. But as the train sped into the darkness, a strange feeling began to creep over him. He realized he hadn't heard the conductor's voice over the intercom. No announcements about the next stop, no reminders to mind the gap. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the train's engines. Ben looked around. The carriage was still empty. He leaned out into the aisle and glanced through the connecting door into the next car. It too was empty. "Hello?" he called out. His voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the stillness. No response. Ben sat back, trying to shake off the unease. He pulled out his phone, intending to pass the time, but the screen showed no signal. "Of course," he muttered. He stared out the window, but the world outside was an impenetrable black void. No lights, no passing towns, just endless darkness. Minutes turned into an hour, or maybe more. Ben wasn't sure. He checked his watch, but the hands seemed to be stuck at 12:15. The silence deepened, pressing against his eardrums. It was almost as if the train wasn't moving at all, as if it were suspended in some in-between space. And then he heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps, coming from the next carriage. Ben froze. He strained his ears, his breath caught in his throat. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right on the other side of the door. The connecting door slid open and a man stepped through. He was tall, dressed in a pristine black suit that looked oddly outdated, like something from the 1930s. His face was pale and expressionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Without acknowledging Ben, the man walked to the far end of the carriage and sat down. Ben let out a shaky breath, trying to convince himself it was normal. Maybe the man had boarded at a station he hadn't noticed. But the man didn't move. He just sat there, perfectly still, his head slightly tilted as if he were listening to something Ben couldn't hear. Unnerved, Ben decided to move to another carriage. He gathered his things and headed for the connecting door. The next carriage was identical to the first. Same leather seats, same polished floors. And it was empty. Ben walked through 2 more carriages, each one a perfect replica of the last. No passengers, no conductor, nothing. He turned to go back but hesitated. Through the glass door behind him, he saw the man in the suit. He was standing now, staring directly at Ben. Ben's heart hammered in his chest. He turned and sprinted down the aisle, throwing open door after door, moving deeper into the train. The carriages began to change. The pristine leather seats were replaced by cracked vinyl, the floors scuffed and stained. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows. Finally, he reached the last carriage. It was different from the others, filled with wooden benches instead of seats. The air was colder here, and the windows were fogged over. At the far end of the carriage, a group of people sat silently. Their clothes were old-fashioned, tattered, and covered in dust. Their heads were bowed, faces obscured. "Excuse me," Ben said, his voice shaking. "Do you know what's going on? Where is this train going?" The figures didn't respond. Ben moved Ed closer, reaching out to tap the shoulder of the nearest passenger. As his hand touched the fabric, the figure collapsed into a pile of ash. Ben staggered back, his stomach lurching. The other figures began to crumble one by one, until the carriage was filled with nothing but dust. A low hum filled the air, growing louder and more distorted. Ben turned and ran back the way he came, but the carriages were changing faster now. The walls were covered in graffiti that seemed to shift and writhe. The seats ripped apart, stuffing spilling out like entrails. And then the man in the suit was there, standing in the middle of the aisle. "You shouldn't have boarded this train," the man said, his voice cold and hollow. Ben backed away, his legs trembling. I just needed to get home." "This train doesn't go home," the man replied. "It collects those who are lost. And now, so are you." The train screeched to a halt, throwing Ben off balance. The man in the suit stepped closer, his pale face splitting into a grotesque grin. The last thing Ben saw before the lights went out was the man reaching for him. The midnight train from Summit Falls to Red Hollow was known for being quiet, almost eerily so. Most passengers were tired workers or students heading home, content to bury themselves in books, music, or sleep. It was a straight shot through dense woods and forgotten towns, a 2-hour journey of near silence. For Claire, a freelance journalist heading home after a long assignment, the train stillness was usually a welcome reprieve, but tonight something felt different. As she boarded the train at Summit Falls, she noticed how empty it was. Apart from herself, there were only a handful of passengers scattered throughout the car. An older man reading a newspaper, a young woman scrolling on her phone, and a teenager with headphones slouched in his seat. Claire picked a window seat in the middle of the car, placing her bag beside her. She glanced at her phone. No service. Typical for this route. With a resigned sigh, she pulled out her notebook and began jotting down ideas for her next article. The train jerked to life, the engine humming as it pulled away from the station. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks filled the air, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. 40 minutes into the ride, Claire noticed the train was moving faster than usual. The scenery outside blurred into streaks of green and black, and the gentle sway of the car had turned into a violent, erratic motion. The older man with the newspaper folded it down, frowning. "Feels like the engineer's in a hurry tonight." Claire nodded, though she didn't believe it. She'd taken this train dozens of times, and it had never moved like this. A loud clang echoed through the car, making everyone jump. The teenager pulled off his headphones. "What was that?" he asked, his voice shaky. No one answered. Claire stood and made her way to the end of the car, peering through the small window in the door that led to the next carriage. The lights flickered beyond, but she saw no one. She returned to her seat, her unease growing. The young woman with the phone finally spoke up. "Does anyone else think it's weirdly quiet? Like, where's the conductor? Or the ticket inspector?" Her words settled over the group like a heavy fog. Claire realised she hadn't seen any staff since boarding. Not the conductor, not the attendants, no one. "I'll check," Claire said, standing again. The older man shook his head. "Don't go alone. I'll come with you." Together they moved through the swaying cars, gripping seats and railings for balance. They passed through 2 more passenger cars, both empty, before reaching the dining car. It was deserted, the tables pristine, as if no one had eaten there in years. "Where is everyone?" Claire whispered. The man didn't answer. He was staring ahead at the door to the engine room, which was slightly ajar. They approached cautiously. The hum of the engine grew louder, a low, almost menacing growl. Claire pushed the door open, revealing the controls, and no one at the helm. "What the hell?" the man muttered. The control panel was lit up, the speed gauge redlining. The levers and dials moved on their own, as if guided by invisible hands. Claire reached for the brake lever, but it wouldn't budge. "It's not responding," she said, panic creeping into her voice. The older man pressed a button on the intercom. "Hello? Is anyone there? We've got a problem." Only static answered. Claire turned to him. "We need to tell the others." They hurried back to the passenger car, where the remaining passengers were already on edge. "There's no driver," Claire said. "The train's running on its own." The young woman stood, her face pale. "What do you mean? That's not possible." The older man shook his head. "I've seen the cab myself. It's empty." The teenager laughed nervously. "So what? Like what? The train's haunted?" No one answered, but the silence spoke volumes. The train continued to accelerate, the cars groaning under the strain. Outside, the dense woods were a blur, the moonlight barely breaking through the canopy. The temperature inside the car began to drop, frost creeping up the windows. Claire grabbed her phone, hoping to contact someone, anyone, but there was still no service. She cursed under her breath. "Look!" the young woman shouted, pointing out the window. The passengers crowded around, their breath fogging the glass. Through the trees, faint lights flickered, moving parallel to the train. At first, Claire thought it was a car on a nearby road, but the lights didn't behave like headlights. They bobbed and weaved unnaturally, as if floating. "What is that?" the teenager asked. The lights drew closer, revealing ghostly figures that seemed to glide just above the ground. Their faces were pale and featureless, their bodies shrouded in tattered, glowing mist. "Are they chasing us?" the older man whispered. Claire's heart raced. "We need to do something. If this train doesn't stop..." Another loud clang interrupted her, this one closer. The car shook violently, and the lights flickered overhead. "They're getting on," the young woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. The passengers backed away as one of the spectral figures appeared at the rear of the car. It passed through the closed door as if it weren't there, its glowing form pulsating with an otherworldly light. The teenager screamed, throwing a backpack at the figure. It passed through harmlessly, the ghost unfazed. "What do you want?" Claire demanded, her voice trembling. The ghost turned its blank face toward her, tilting its head. Then it raised an arm, pointing toward the engine room. "The controls?" Claire asked. The ghost didn't respond, but it didn't need to. Claire understood. "It wants us to stop the train," she said. "How?" the older man asked. "The brakes don't work." "I don't know," Claire admitted, "but we don't have a choice." With the ghost following at a distance, Claire and the older man made their way back to the engine room. The train was shaking violently now, the walls groaning as if they might tear apart at any moment. The control panel was sparking, the dials spinning wildly. Claire gritted her teeth and grabbed the brake lever again, pulling with all her strength. Nothing. The ghost appeared beside her, its glowing arm passing through the controls. The train jolted, slowing slightly, but it wasn't enough. "What do we do?" Claire shouted. The older man pointed to a glowing symbol that had appeared on the control panel, a jagged, angular mark that pulsed with an eerie red light. "That wasn't there before," he said. Claire hesitated, then pressed the symbol. The train let out a deafening screech, the wheels sparking as it began to slow. The ghost let out an otherworldly wail, its form flickering before vanishing entirely. When the train finally came to a halt, it was on a forgotten stretch of track deep in the forest. The passengers regrouped, shaken but alive. "Was that real?" the teenager asked, his voice trembling. Claire didn't answer. She stepped off the train, her legs unsteady. The tracks behind them were warped, twisted as if something massive had forced the train forward. The older man placed a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever that was, it let us go." Claire nodded, though she wasn't sure they were truly safe. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a train whistle echoed through the night. It was supposed to be a simple late-night commute. Eleanor had spent the day visiting her mother in a small rural town. By the time she boarded the last train to the city, it was nearly midnight. The platform was eerily quiet, lit by a single flickering bulb. The train arrived with a hiss of brakes, the old engine groaning as it pulled to a stop. The conductor gave her a brief nod as she climbed aboard. The carriage was mostly empty, save for a handful of passengers scattered throughout. Eleanor chose a window seat in the middle, setting her bag on the seat beside her. The train began to move, rumbling along the tracks. She leaned her head against the cool glass, watching the dark countryside roll past. The gentle rocking of the train and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels were almost soothing. But then, something strange happened. About 20 minutes into the journey, the train took a sharp turn. Eleanor sat up, frowning. She'd taken this route dozens of times, and she didn't recall any turns like that. She glanced around, but the other passengers seemed unconcerned. A man a few rows ahead was asleep, his head lolling against the window. A young woman further down was engrossed in a book. Outside, the familiar fields and farms had disappeared, replaced by dense, towering trees. The train was heading into a forest. Eleanor checked her phone, hoping to pull up a map, but there was no signal. The screen glowed faintly in the dim carriage, displaying the time, 12:13 a.m. She stood and approached the conductor, who was sitting in a small booth near the front of the carriage. "Excuse me," she said. "Is this train taking a detour? I don't recognize this route." The conductor looked up, his face impassive. "There's been a change," he said curtly. "Nothing to worry about. Please return to your seat." "But return to your seat, miss." His tone left no room for argument. Eleanor hesitated, but eventually walked back to her spot. She sat down, her unease growing. The train continued deeper into the forest. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches pressing against the windows like grasping fingers. The outside world was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the train's lights. The carriage grew colder. Eleanor pulled her jacket tighter around herself, glancing at the other passengers. No one else seemed to notice the chill. Then the lights began to flicker. It started as a faint buzzing overhead, followed by brief flashes of darkness. Eleanor's heart raced as the flickering grew more erratic, casting strange shadows across the carriage. And then the train screeched to a halt. The sudden stop threw Eleanor forward, her hands gripping the seat in front of her. The the lights went out completely, plunging the carriage into darkness. "Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be experiencing a delay," the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. "Please remain seated." Eleanor's stomach twisted. She peered out the window, but there was nothing but darkness outside. No moonlight, no stars, just an endless void. The minutes dragged on. The other passengers sat silently, their faces obscured by shadows. Eleanor's unease grew unbearable. She stood, deciding to move toward the front of the train, where the conductor might have answers. As she passed the other passengers, she noticed something strange. They weren't moving. The man who'd been asleep earlier was now sitting upright, his eyes wide open but unblinking. The young woman with the book was frozen mid-turn of a page, her hand suspended in the air. Eleanor's breath quickened. She reached out to shake the man's shoulder, but he didn't respond. His skin was cold to the touch, his face eerily blank. Panic rising, Eleanor hurried to the next carriage. It was empty. The seats were torn and dusty, as if the carriage hadn't been used in years. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. She moved to the next carriage, and the next, each one more decrepit than the last. The walls were covered in dark stains, the floors littered with debris. Finally, she reached the engine room. The door was ajar, and she pushed it open, stepping inside. The conductor was there, standing with his back to her. "Sir," Eleanor said, her voice trembling, "what's going on? Why did we stop?" The conductor turned slowly. His face was pale and hollow, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He smiled, but it was wrong, too wide, his teeth too sharp. "This train doesn't stop for the living," he said. Eleanor stumbled back, her mind racing. She turned and ran, retracing her steps through the carriages. But the train had changed. The windows were gone, replaced by solid walls. The seats were now covered in strange carvings, symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse as she passed. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the dim light. And then she heard it, a faint whispering, growing louder with every step. She turned a corner and froze. The passengers were there, standing in the aisle. Their faces were blank, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They stared at her, unmoving, as the whispering grew to a deafening roar. Eleanor backed away, her heart pounding. She turned and ran in the opposite direction, desperate to find an exit. She reached the rear of the train, where a single door led to the outside. She yanked it open and leapt into the darkness. She hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop. When she looked up, the train was gone. Eleanor found herself in the middle of the forest, the trees pressing in around her. The air was deathly silent, and the ground beneath her was cold and damp. She checked her phone, but the screen was still frozen at 12:13 a.m. A faint light appeared in the distance. Hope flared in her chest, and she stumbled toward it. But as she drew closer, she realized the light wasn't coming from a house or a road. It was the train. It sat on the tracks, its doors open, waiting for her. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the whispering returned, louder and more insistent. The train wasn't just waiting, it was calling her. She turned and ran into the forest, the sound of the train's whistle echoing behind her. The light grew brighter, chasing her through the trees. No matter how far she ran, she couldn't escape it. The train was always there, just behind her, its dark presence pressing against her mind. And then she tripped. As she fell, the light enveloped her, and the world went black. The next morning, a group of hikers found an abandoned train deep in the forest. Its carriages were old and rusted, the windows shattered. Inside, they found no passengers, only Eleanor's bag sitting neatly on a seat near the middle. The train was never seen again. The night was bitterly cold as the late-night train from Norwalk to Redhaven sped through the countryside. Inside, the passengers were a mix of late-shift workers, travellers and students heading home for the holidays. The atmosphere was subdued, with most people staring at their phones, reading, or dozing against the windows. Leah sat in a window seat, her headphones on, staring out into the darkness. The train cut through fields and forests, the lights inside reflecting faintly off the glass. She glanced at her phone. No signal. Not unusual for this stretch of the route, but it still made her uneasy. A jolt shook the train suddenly, making her grip the edge of her seat. Other passengers looked up, startled as the train lurched again, this time harder. Leah pulled out her earbuds, her heart racing. "Is that normal?" the man across the aisle asked nervously. looking at a conductor walking briskly toward the front of the train. No, Leah said, though she didn't know for sure. The train swayed violently, and passengers screamed as it left the tracks with a deafening screech of metal. Leah clung to the armrest as the carriage tilted, slamming her sideways into the window. The sound of trees snapping and the grinding of metal on earth filled the air as the train ploughed into the forest. Then, silence. For a moment, Leah couldn't move. Her head throbbed and her body ached from the impact. Around her, passengers groaned and cried out in the darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the carriage in a dim, eerie glow. "Is everyone okay?" a woman's voice called out shakily. Leah looked around. Seats were torn from the floor, luggage was scattered everywhere, and one of the windows had shattered, letting in the icy air. "I think so," Leah replied, her voice weak. She stood unsteadily, checking herself for injuries. A gash on her arm oozed blood, but it didn't feel serious. The man across the aisle groaned, clutching his leg. "I think it's broken," he said through gritted teeth. Leah moved to help him, tearing a strip from her scarf to tie around his leg as a makeshift splint. Around them, passengers began helping each other, their fear replaced by a desperate need to survive. "What happened?" someone near the back asked. "I don't know," said a woman who'd been sitting closer to the front. "The train just derailed." "Why?" Leah asked, but no one had an answer. One of the conductors entered the car, his face pale. "Everyone stay calm," he said, though his voice trembled. "We've called for help, but it'll take time to get here. We need to stay together and wait for rescue." "Stay here?" a man in a business suit exclaimed. "The train's wrecked in the middle of nowhere. It's freezing." "It's safer inside," the conductor insisted. "This forest isn't safe." Leah's stomach turned at his tone. He wasn't just warning them about the cold. "What do you mean, not safe?" she asked, stepping forward. The conductor hesitated. "This stretch of forest is isolated. There have been stories. People go missing out here. It's better if we stay together." The passengers murmured nervously, but before anyone could press the conductor further, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the rear of the train. Leah's heart leapt as she turned toward the sound. A young man who had gone to check the last car stumbled back into view, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" the conductor demanded. "There's something out there," the man shouted. "Something huge. It's watching us." Before anyone could react, a deafening roar shook the carriage. It was deep and guttural, unlike anything Leah had ever heard. The sound vibrated through her chest, filling her with a primal fear. The conductor turned to the group. "Everyone, back into the center car. Move, now." Panic erupted as passengers scrambled to obey. Leah helped the man with the broken leg, half dragging him toward the connecting door. She glanced out one of the shattered windows as they moved and froze. Something was moving in the shadows. At first, it was just a glint of eyes, dozens of them, reflecting the emergency lights. Then shapes began to emerge from the darkness. Tall, spindly figures with elongated limbs and jagged, bony features. Their movements were unnaturally smooth, almost fluid, as they crept closer to the wreckage. Leah tore her gaze away and pushed the man through the door into the next car. "Close it!" someone yelled. The young man slammed the door shut and locked it. The passengers huddled together, their breath visible in the freezing air. "What are those things?" a woman sobbed. "I don't know," the conductor said, his voice shaking. "But they've been seen before. This forest, it's theirs." Another roar echoed outside, followed by the sound of metal tearing. The creatures were ripping through the wreckage. "We're trapped," the man with the broken leg whispered. "No," Leah said, her mind racing. "There has to be a way out. Is there another exit?" The conductor hesitated, then nodded. "The front car, it has a hatch to the roof. We could climb out and make a run for it." "Run where?" a woman demanded. "There's a ranger station about a mile from here," the conductor said. "If we can get there—" Another roar cut him off as the door behind them shuddered violently. "They're coming!" someone screamed. "We don't have a choice," Leah said. "We have to try." The group moved quickly, helping the injured and grabbing anything that could be used as a weapon. A fire extinguisher, broken metal rods, even shards of glass. They reached the front car, and the conductor climbed onto a seat to unlatch the hatch. Above them, the forest loomed, its branches forming a twisted canopy. One by one, the passengers climbed onto the roof. Leah helped the man with the broken leg, hoisting him up before pulling herself through the hatch. From their vantage point, they could see the creatures swarming the wreckage below. Their jagged limbs glinted in the dim light as they tore through the train, searching. "Move!" the conductor whispered urgently. The group began to climb down the side of the train, their breaths shallow with fear. Leah's heart pounded as she dropped onto the forest floor. The cold air bit at her skin, but she ignored it. "Which way to the station?" she asked the conductor. He pointed east. "Stay together. Stay quiet." They moved quickly, weaving through the trees. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of branches or distant roar. Leah glanced behind her and froze. The creatures had spotted them. "Run!" she shouted. The group broke into a sprint, the creatures closing in fast. Leah's legs burned as she pushed herself harder, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The ranger station appeared through the trees, a small, weathered building with a flickering light above the door. "Go!" Leah screamed. They reached the station and threw open the door, piling inside. The conductor slammed it shut and locked it, leaning against it as if his weight alone could keep the creatures out. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. Outside, the creatures circled the building, their glowing eyes peering through the windows. "What do we do now?" someone whispered. Leah looked around the station, her mind racing. There was a radio on the desk, and she hurried to it, flipping switches and turning dials. "Hello? Can anyone hear me? We need help." Static crackled over the speaker, then a voice. "This is Ranger Outpost 12. Who's there?" Leah's heart leapt. "We're stranded. Our train derailed, and there are things out here. We need help." "Hold tight," the ranger said. "We're sending a team." The creatures outside roared, slamming against the walls of the station. "Please hurry," Leah whispered, clutching the radio as the lights flickered above her. And then the monsters broke through.